Chapter 26 of The Beast of Buckingham Palace by David Walliams, narrated by me. Part 3, A Tower of Traitors. Chapter 26, Black Water. A hood was pulled over Alfred's head so he couldn't see a thing. Next, the condemned boy was marched along the corridors of Buckingham Palace by 2 royal guards, and down flights and flights of stairs. The Lord Protector led the way as the all-seeing eye hovered close behind. The guards held the boy's arms tight. It was painful, and the prince could feel bruises blackening on his arms. "Can I at least say goodbye to Nanny?" he pleaded, his voice muffled by the hood. Maybe he could deliver a secret message to her. Maybe she could save him. "I'm afraid not. Nanny's in our interrogation room as we speak. I expect her to be there for a long time." The prince felt a pain in his heart. He desperately hoped he hadn't brought some terrible fate onto this kind old lady. "She's innocent," protested the boy. "We shall see. The interrogation is very..." The Lord Protector chose his words carefully. "Persuasive." "Torture!" exclaimed the boy. "You'll find out for yourself soon enough." Alfred began trembling so much he felt as if his legs were going to collapse behind him. The guards took his weight and began dragging him along. A door opened and closed behind them. From the unfamiliar sounds echoing around, Alfred guessed they were no longer in the palace. Tap, tap, tap. "Where are we?" he asked. "If I told you, then it wouldn't be a secret." It sounded like they were in some kind of narrow passageway. "Where are you taking me?" demanded the boy. "Be patient, young prince. All will be revealed." They walked some more before there was a sound of a very heavy door, or even wall, sliding to one side. Whirr! Then there was a sound of it closing. Whirr! The group took a few more steps forward and finally came to a halt. The guards held the boy still for a moment before his hood was whipped off. He blinked. Prince Alfred was in the outside world for the very first time in his life. Black water lapped at his feet, and looking up, he saw some stone arches. Instantly, he realised he was underneath a bridge. Westminster Bridge, to be precise. From his books on London, Alfred had learned that this bridge was used to be one of the busiest in the city, with people and traffic continuously crossing the River Thames. Now, Alfred could see that people had set up home all along the bridges in cardboard boxes and wooden crates. His heart ached for them as he noticed all they had over their heads to keep the rain out were old bits of tarpaulin. Alfred looked behind him, but there was no entrance visible back to Buckingham Palace, just a stone wall. There must be a secret way in and out, but the Lord Protector was not sharing it. "Your royal barrage, sir," announced the man as the all-seeing eye hovered behind him. Right on cue, a long wooden rowing boat, decorated with ornate carvings, painted mostly in gold, drifted into view. It was manned by at least a dozen royal guards, who lifted their oars as they reached the riverbank. "Your Royal Highness, this is where I bid you farewell," purred the Lord Protector. "For the very last time." "You can't do this to me," protested Alfred, struggling with the guards. "I'm a prince! I'm the heir to the throne!" "You're nothing but a traitor. Guards, take him to the tower." As Alfred struggled, "Get your hands off me! You're controlling my father, but you can't control me!" As the guards gripped harder. Now they were squeezing his arms so tightly he was in agony. "Ugh!" "Is that so?" purred the Lord Protector. "Put him in chains." Roughly, they led the boy down the slippery stone steps to the barge. One metal chain went round the boy's feet, another round his hands, which were tied behind his back, and another acted as a collar round his neck. Then he was shackled to the flagpole at the front of the barge. "I know what you're doing," called out Alfred. "Creating some kind of monster." "It seems you're having visions. just like your father. The tower should cure you of those." The Lord Protector nodded, and the guards began rowing the prince away. The wooden oars sliced through the water in perfect time. Swish, swash, swish, swash, swish, swash. On the riverbank, the Lord Protector, flanked by the all-seeing eye, gave the boy one final wave as the barge moved off. "Goodbye, forever," he said. Alfred turned his head around so the man wouldn't see his tears. There was a thick fog around the River Thames, and the city seemed eerily quiet. Shapes and shadows unravelled themselves around the barge. Debris bobbed in the black water. Upturned boats, shoes, hats, books, suitcases, an umbrella, even the child's doll. Each item told a story. A horror story. The boat swept along the Thames almost without a sound. The oars made much less noise than the motor, so the barge was perfect for transporting prisoners to the Tower of London. Alfred's thoughts turned to his mother. This was the exact same journey that she must have made. From the bow of the barge, the boy could make out the shapes of London landmarks through the thick fog. The London Eye, a huge wheel for people to travel on to see the sights, was now lying on its side. The Globe, a recreation of Shakespeare's theatre, lay in ruins. Southwark Cathedral, which had been without a roof since a fire had it all destroyed, was now a blackened ruin. As the barge approached London Bridge, Alfred could make out some figures standing amongst boxes and tents. The bridge, like the others along the Thames, was home to these poor souls. As the boat passed underneath, there were shouts and a barrage of sticks and stones hit the vessel. Bang! Bash! Bonk! "We need food! Help us! We're starving!" In desperation, some of the people leaped down from the bridge. A few missed the barge and fell into the water. Splash! When they tried to scramble aboard the boat, the guards whacked them away with their wooden oars. Thwack! They fell back into the river. "Don't!" screamed Alfred. Splosh! Two of them actually landed on the barge. Thud! Thud! They came down at the stern and were immediately taken out with laser guns. Zap! Zap! Their bodies plunged into the Thames. Splash! Splosh! "Murderers!" shouted Alfred at the royal guards, helpless to stop the horror. The barge continued its journey along the Thames. Slowly, out of the fog, an ancient building loomed into view. The Tower of London. At the base was its famous entrance from the river, Traitor's Gate. The prince closed his eyes. He was about to meet his fate. Chapter 27. Traitor's Gate. All along the battlements of the Tower of London, Alfred could make out members of the fearsome royal guard. They had their laser guns pointed down at the river. As the royal barge approached the gate, it was raised. Creak! Like so many traitors before him, down the centuries, this was the way the boy was about to begin his imprisonment in the tower. With his hands and feet still in chains, he was taken off the bridge. Then he was bustled down a series of stone walkways until he reached a prison block. Once inside, what hit Alfred first was the stench. It was medieval. Then the noise. Constant cries of pain. "Ah! Help! Please!" The Tower of London was the worst place Alfred could possibly imagine. Prisoners were crammed into tiny cells, as many as a dozen to help each dark, damp little space, and treated worse than animals in a zoo. The prisoners' faces were blackened with dirt and hollow with hunger. They were dressed in rags with no shoes on their feet. When the boy was marched past the cells, some called out, "Who's that boy?" "Is it Prince Alfred?" "What's he doing here?" One toothless old lady just laughed and laughed in a way that you think she must be mad. Ha ha ha! A boy held out his hands to beg. "Please, Please! Alfred wasn't sure what he was begging for mercy, he supposed. Not that he could give it. The prince was now one of them. A prisoner, too. He continued past his fellow inmates. Was that old man in chains once commander of the British Army? One night he'd vanished from the palace. Was the man with a long grey beard the old chief of police? He'd not been seen in decades. Was that Britain's last prime minister, shivering under a dirty old blanket? He had been arrested the day that Alfred was born. The Tower of London must have housed 100 or more of these so-called traitors. The prince was desperate to catch sight of his mother. Was she even still alive? As Alfred was dragged along the row of cells, he turned to the guards and said, "I am your prince! I demand to see the Queen!" But the guards just ignored him. Instead, they tightened their grip on the prince's arms. Ow! And continued marching him to his cell. Once there, the guards hurled the boy inside. Thud! Oof! The chains round his arms and legs were unlocked. Clink! And the door was bolted behind him. Clunk! Alfred ran to the rusty iron bars on the door of his cell and shouted at the guards. "You can't just leave me here to rot!" But they just did. The prison cell hadn't changed much since the Tower of London had been built in the 11th century. The walls were dark stone, hay was scattered across the floor, and in the corner crouched a little wooden bucket. Alfred presumed this was to do his business in. Being born a prince, Alfred had been sure he would be able to go through life without ever doing his business in a bucket. But he was wrong. While Alfred felt the brief sense of bliss that came with finally having a pee, he could hear a tapping on the ceiling. Tap, tap, tap. At first, the boy was irritated. It was really putting him off his pee. But as soon as he'd finished, he stood still so he could listen. Tap, tap, tap. 3 in a row. The same rhythm as before. Tap, tap, tap. Alfred wanted to tap back, but even on his tiptoes, he wasn't tall enough to reach the ceiling. If only he hadn't filled that bucket with pee, he could stand on it. Tap, tap, tap. There it was again. Never mind, thought the boy. There was a tiny hole in the corner of the cell, which he carefully poured the yellow liquid. Trickle! "Oi!" came a deep voice from below. "You dirty blighter!" "Sorry," he called back. He had only been in the Tower of London for 5 minutes, and he'd already upset one of the other prisoners by pouring pee on his head. Next, Alfred overturned the bucket and stood on it. His hand just reached the ceiling. He clenched his fist and tapped back. Tap, tap, tap. Then, from above, there were another 3 taps. Tap, tap, tap. Alfred began to feel a bit silly. What on earth was the point of all this tapping? Suddenly, he heard scraping from above. Whoever was up there was trying to scratch a hole. Alfred jumped down off the bucket and on his hands and knees searched the floor of his cell. He was looking for anything sharp that could be used to dig from his side. Nothing. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that one of the stones in the wall were jutting out. Using the bucket, he smashed down on it. Bash! Chipping a bit off. Clink! Then, Alfred climbed back on the bucket and began scraping away at the ceiling. Scratch! 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 Outside, he could hear the bootsteps approaching. Stomp! 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 A royal guard was on patrol. Alfred leaped down and pretended to be going to the toilet by sitting on the bucket. When the guard peered through the metal bars, the boy called back, "Do you mind? I used to be a prince, you know." The guard shook his head and moved off. Immediately, Alfred got back to work. Scratch! 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 Eventually, grit fell down onto his face. Crunch! As the hole was broken through, Alfred put his eye up to it. An eye stared back. At first, he was startled, until he realised that eye better than his own. It was his mother's. That's the end of these chapters, folks. If you enjoyed, please do not forget to like and subscribe. Stay safe. Bye-bye.